in the hours after Pearl Harbor burned, Japanese pilots on the island of Formosa sat beside their planes in a heavy fog, waiting. When it lifted, they flew south toward the Philippines and found 60 American aircraft sitting in neat rows on the ground, engines cold, crews eating lunch. This is episode 20 of our long-form journey through the Second World War. In our last episode, we watched the attack on Pearl Harbor, the planning, the silence before the strike, and the morning that changed everything. Tonight, as the quiet of the evening settles around you, we follow the cascade that came next, from the burning runways of Clark Field to the last radio transmission tapped out by a soldier from Brooklyn deep inside a crumbling tunnel, from the beaches of Malaya to the corridors of Singapore, where an empire's confidence finally met the thing it had refused to imagine. From a naval battle in the Java Sea to the last bottles of wine drunk in a burning city in Burma. It is a story of boldness and paralysis, of small garrisons that held far longer than anyone expected, and of the 6 months in which Japan remade the map of half the world. I've shaped this narrative carefully so it can hold you gently as the tension of the day dissolves. If these episodes bring you comfort, a like and a subscription help more than you know, and I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from tonight. Take a slow breath and let's begin. While Pearl Harbor burned and the smoke of shattered battleships drifted over the harbor at Oahu, a different kind of waiting was underway some 3,000 miles to the west. On the island of Formosa, pilots of Japan's 11th Imperial Air Fleet had spent the night sitting beside their aircraft in a heavy, unsettling fog. Their orders were to bomb the American airfields in the Philippines, targets roughly 500 miles to the south, as part of a sweeping, coordinated blow aimed simultaneously at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Guam, and Manila. The plan was enormous in its ambition. And now, in the grey hours before dawn, the fog refused to lift. Tension gathered alongside the mist. Hours passed. Then, at 6 in the morning, a loudspeaker crackled to life across the airfield with an announcement that Pearl Harbor had been struck. A devastating surprise attack, the voice said. The Japanese flyers erupted. Some whooped. Some danced. But elation quickly gave way to a harder calculation. The Americans, they reasoned, would no longer be caught unprepared. An alert enemy would surely be waiting in the Philippines with fighters already airborne, radar scanning the horizon, guns pointed skyward. Worse still, every hour the fog held meant the Americans might launch their own bombers northward and catch the Formosa-based planes sitting motionless on the ground. The fog lifted eventually. The American bombers never came. By mid-morning on December 8th, Philippine time, 108 Japanese bombers and 84 Zero fighters were climbing into the sky above Formosa and turning south toward Luzon, bracing for a fierce reception. What they found instead stopped them cold. A Zero pilot named Saburo Sakai, approaching Clark Field northwest of Manila, later described the scene as simply unbelievable. Where he had expected a swarm of American fighters rising to meet them, he looked down to find some 60 aircraft sitting in neat rows along the runways, still and unmoving, as though the war had not yet reached them. The bombers swept across the field at 22,000 feet. American anti-aircraft fire climbed upward but burst thousands of feet too low, scattered and harmless. A handful of American fighters managed to scramble into the air, but they were already too late. Sakai watched the bombs tumble from the bays in long strings, arcing downward toward the airfield below. The ground seemed to heave. Hangars disintegrated. Pieces of aircraft spiraled into the air. Fire erupted in a dozen places at once, and thick black smoke coiled upward into the Philippine sky. Behind the bombers came the Zeros, dropping low for strafing runs. Sakai himself shot up two B-17 bombers still sitting on the runway. Then, climbing away, he caught an American P-40 fighter that had managed to get airborne, lined it up in his sights, and fired. The cockpit canopy shattered and blew off. The fighter staggered and fell. It was Sakai's first kill of the war, the first of many that would eventually make him the leading Japanese air ace to survive the entire conflict. The attackers flew home in high spirits, though something nagged at them. When the Japanese bombers touched down again on Formosa and the crews climbed out into the afternoon heat, one airman turned to another and asked with genuine puzzlement what was the matter with the enemy. It seemed, he said, as though they did not even know the war had started. The enemy knew. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding all American Army forces in the Far East, had been roused in his suite at the Manila Hotel at 3:30 that morning. A warrant officer, listening to a dance program on shortwave radio from the United States, had picked up word of Pearl Harbor and passed it along. By 5 o'clock, Washington had confirmed the report and MacArthur's staff had assembled at his headquarters on Calais, Victoria. The warning had come even earlier than that morning. Washington had alerted MacArthur as far back as November 27th to the genuine possibility of attack, and Japanese aircraft had since been spotted over Luzon. His intelligence officers doubted that Japanese planes on Formosa could reach Luzon and return. The distance seemed too great, but MacArthur had already ordered his force of 35 heavy B-17 bombers move south to a less exposed base in Mindanao, far from Clark Field. The problem was that urgency had never fully taken root. When the war came, half of those B-17s were still at Clark. Major General Louis Brereton, commanding American air forces in the Philippines, had acted swiftly that morning. Learning of Pearl Harbor, he immediately sought permission to send his bombers against the Japanese airfields on Formosa. The mission would be difficult. No adequate maps, no reconnaissance photographs, the aircraft undergunned and slow, and the distance too great to allow for fighter escort. But Brereton believed some damage could be done. He put the request to MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Major General Richard Sutherland, and then waited. For several hours there was no answer. As a precaution, Brereton ordered the B-17s at Clark airborne with fighter cover to protect them while the decision was made. Then, shortly after 10 in the morning, MacArthur approved a more limited step, a photographic reconnaissance flight over Formosa, which might allow a bombing raid the following day. Brereton recalled his planes to refuel. At approximately 12:20 in the afternoon, while the aircraft sat in neat rows on the ground and the crews were inside eating lunch and poring over what few maps they had, the Japanese arrived. The destruction was total. 18 B-17s were obliterated where they sat. 53 P-40 fighters were destroyed, along with roughly 30 other aircraft. 80 men were killed and 150 wounded. Among the ground installations lost was a radar set that might have given warning of the raid, except that it had not yet been fully installed. In the opening hours of the war in the Pacific, MacArthur had surrendered half his air force without a fight. The strikes had gone almost perfectly. In the space of a single morning, American naval and air power, the two pillars upon which Pacific defense rested, had been dealt blows so severe that the entire strategic footing of the United States in that ocean had shifted beneath them. Pearl Harbor was still smoldering. The Philippines had been gutted from the air, and these were only 2 points on a map that now showed Japanese forces in simultaneous motion across thousands of miles of open ocean, moving against targets so distant from one another that the sheer coordination of it was, even from the outside, something close to staggering. Guam had been bombed. Wake Island had been bombed. Invasions of both would follow. To understand what Japan intended, one must step back and see the whole architecture of the plan at once, not as a series of strikes, but as a single interlocking design, methodical in its preparation and breathtaking in its geographic ambition. The purpose was not simply to wound the Americans, it was to remove them entirely from the Western Pacific, at least for long enough to accomplish something far larger. Japan needed time to build, to fortify, to consolidate gains across a region so vast that any eventual American response would face not just enemy soldiers, but staggering distances, missing bases, and a supply problem of near impossible complexity. The instrument of this strategy was a chain of air and naval installations stretching in a great arc across the Western Pacific, a cordon that military planners sometimes called a picket line, island by island, atoll by atoll. Japan intended to close off the Western Ocean behind a wall of fortified positions. American power, driven back across that wall, would find no foothold close enough to matter, and behind the safety of that line, Japanese forces would be free to press southward along a sequence of objectives that had been carefully ordered in Tokyo. First came the Philippines, the largest American military presence in Asia, sitting astride Japan's supply routes to the south. Next came British Malaya, and with it the fortress of Singapore, the most powerful British naval base in the entire Eastern Hemisphere, the linchpin of Britain's hold on Southeast Asia, the symbol above all others of Western power in that part of the world. Topple Singapore and the British position east of India would begin to unravel. And once those two anchors had been pried loose, the path into the Dutch East Indies would lie open. The islands of that vast archipelago, Borneo, Celebes, Sumatra, Java, were scattered across thousands of miles of tropical sea, and beneath their jungle canopy sat something Japan needed with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Oil, the refineries of Sumatra, the petroleum fields of Borneo, the reserves stockpiled on Java, these were the fuel without which Japan's warships could not keep station, its aircraft could not stay aloft, and its entire military apparatus would gradually cease and go quiet. An American oil embargo, imposed in the summer of 1941, had already begun to bite. The Dutch East Indies were the answer that Japan's war planners had settled upon, and the whole elaborate structure of simultaneous strikes across the Pacific was, in a deeper sense, a means of clearing the road to that oil. The design then was a cascade, each stage making the next one possible. Neutralize American power first, destroy British power in the southeast second, seize the oil fields third. Behind the enormous defensive perimeter that would encircle all of these gains, Japan would consolidate its position, fortify its new outposts, and wait for the Americans, enraged and wounded but thousands of miles away, to spend themselves fighting across an ocean they had effectively lost. It was a gamble of extraordinary audacity. It demanded simultaneous success across half the globe in its opening movements, and left almost no margin for failure where failure mattered most. Japan's military and naval leaders understood this. What they counted on was speed, moving so fast, seizing so much, so quickly, that the Americans would face not just an enemy, but a geography that seemed designed to defeat them before they could even begin. In those first December hours, the opening had gone almost perfectly. The question the rest of that month, and the months that followed, would answer was how far the rest of the design would hold. The first piece of American territory to fall was a small island that most Americans would have struggled to find on a map. Guam sat alone in the Mariana Islands, roughly 1,500 miles east of Manila, a tiny refueling stop for Pan-American clipper flights crossing the Pacific. It was remote, lightly held, and almost entirely without defenses. That had not always been the plan. In 1938, a Navy board had recommended developing Guam into a proper air and submarine base, a fortified outpost capable of defending itself. Congress refused. The reasoning, at least in part, was a reluctance to provoke Japan, whose own island fortifications in the Central Pacific were at that very moment being quietly and extensively expanded. The irony would only become apparent later. On December 8, 1941, Guam was defended by fewer than 500 American Marines and Navy personnel, along with 247 native troops. Their collective armament came to roughly 170 rifles, a handful of World War I era machine guns, and some Browning automatic rifles. There were no artillery pieces capable of reaching a ship offshore. There was no realistic prospect of holding the island against any determined assault. The assault came 2 days later. In the hours after midnight on December 10th, more than 5,000 Japanese Marines and infantrymen waded ashore. By the time dawn broke, they had reached the governor's palace. A brief exchange of fire took place. At 5:45 in the morning, as the sun came up over the water, 3 short blasts of an automobile horn signaled the American ceasefire. Navy Captain George McMillan, commanding the island, surrendered to a Japanese officer who immediately ordered him to remove his clothing down to his undershorts. On that grim and humiliating note, the only American territory in the 3,000 miles of ocean between Wake Island and the Philippines passed out of American hands. It had taken less than 2 days. Wake Island was a different story entirely, at least for a time. Wake was a lonely, low-lying coral atoll about 2,300 miles west of Hawaii. 3 narrow islets arranged in a rough triangle around a lagoon, distinguished mainly by its thundering surf and the constant noise of seabirds. For most of its history, it had been nothing more than a dot on navigational charts. Then, in 1941, as the danger of war drew closer, the Navy began transforming it into an air station, a kind of fixed aircraft carrier guarding the southwestern approaches to the Pacific. Construction was still very much underway when war came. Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham, who had arrived in November to take command, found 1,200 civilian workers building roads, laying landing strips, and dredging a channel through the Coral Lagoon. On the day Pearl Harbor was struck, Wake held 447 Marines under Major James Devereaux, along with some 75 Army Signal Corps and Navy personnel. Their air arm was a squadron of 12 Marine fighter planes, Grumman Wildcats, flown by pilots under Major Paul Putnam. The Wildcats were slower and less agile than the Japanese Zero fighters, and the Marines knew it. For artillery, they had 3 batteries of 5-inch guns and a dozen 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons. Machine guns watched the beaches from scrub thickets. There was no functioning radar and no reliable air raid warning system. When enemy planes were spotted, the standard alert was 3 rifle shots fired into the air. The first attack arrived just before noon on December 7th Pacific time. Devereaux had his bugler sound the call to arms the moment word of Pearl Harbor came through. Ammunition was trucked to the gun batteries and 4 Wildcats went up on patrol. Then a rain squall swept in, and those 4 fighters patrolling at 12,000 feet flew right past 36 Japanese aircraft that had slipped in beneath the clouds from Kwajalein Atoll, 650 miles to the south. The Japanese bombed and strafed Wake's airfield, destroying 7 of the 8 remaining American planes on the ground. The garrison was left with just 4 operational fighters. With those 4 planes, however, Putnam's pilots managed to shoot down half a dozen Japanese bombers over the days that followed, as the enemy returned again and again to pound Wake's defenses. Then came the ships. Shortly after midnight on December 11th, Marine lookouts spotted blinking lights on the dark horizon. By dawn, a Japanese invasion force was visible and closing. 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 patrol boats, and 2 troop transports, all heading toward Wake's coral reef. Commander Cunningham ordered the Marines at the 5-inch gun batteries to hold their fire. Japanese shells began falling as the ships moved within range. Still, the American guns stayed silent. Only when 4 of the enemy warships had closed to within 4,500 yards did the Marines open up. The effect was immediate. The cruiser Yubari, flagship of the attacking force, took 3 hits and limped away from the fight. A destroyer was struck in its ammunition magazine and blew apart, taking every man aboard with it. At one battery, Marine gunners broke into cheering and jumping until Platoon Sergeant Henry Biddell roared them back to their weapons with the kind of language that sergeants are specifically trained to deploy. The Wildcats joined in, dropping 100-pound bombs on the Japanese ships from low altitude. Captain Henry Elrod, flying a plane riddled with anti-aircraft damage, scored a direct hit on the depth charges stored on the afterdeck of the destroyer Kisaragi. She detonated and sank with no survivors. In a battle lasting roughly 45 minutes, a few hundred Marines had turned back an entire Japanese invasion fleet. Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, the Japanese commander, never landed his assault troops at all. He turned his remaining ships around and retreated toward Kwajalein, having lost 2 destroyers and more than 500 men. American losses were a single man killed. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later wrote that the 11th of December 1941 should always stand as a proud day in the history of the Marine Corps. A Japanese naval authority, reflecting on the engagement after the war, called it one of the most humiliating defeats his navy had ever suffered. The men of Wake Island celebrated, but quietly. They knew with the particular clarity that comes from standing at the edge of something vast and hostile that the Japanese would be back. An atoll at that crossroads of the Pacific was too valuable to be left in American hands. The daily air raids continued without pause, methodically working over the island's defenses, probing for weaknesses, wearing the garrison down in the way that sustained bombardment always does, not through single decisive blows, but through the slow accumulation of damage and exhaustion. 2 hours after midnight on December 23rd, the lookout saw ships again. Admiral Kajioka had returned, and this time he had brought far more than 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers. The new invasion force included 6 heavy cruisers and 2 of the aircraft carriers that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Soryu and the Hiryu were now riding offshore. The landing force itself numbered roughly 2,000 special naval troops, among the most hardened assault soldiers in the Japanese military. Commander Cunningham would later describe the hours that followed as unfolding in an atmosphere of desperate confusion. With only one truly clear factor emerging through the chaos, the invaders outnumbered the defenders by a margin that made the outcome, however long it was resisted, essentially certain. About 1,000 Japanese Marines came ashore in the first wave. The American defenders were spread thin across 3 separate islets, with too few men to adequately cover every beach. Some of the civilian construction workers, having found weapons in the disorder of battle, took up positions alongside the Marines. Others, with nothing to arm themselves, pressed into foxholes and waited. The fighting that followed was savage and close. On one islet, 70 Marines held off a Japanese landing force of 100 men, killing nearly all of them. Yet a garbled report reaching the American command post said the position had been overrun. Dive bombers from the carriers roared in at dawn, hitting American positions across the atoll. The last Wildcat fighter had vanished at sea the day before, and there was nothing left to oppose them. Major Putnam and Captain Elrod, their planes gone, picked up rifles and fought alongside the infantry until nearly all of them were dead or wounded. On the largest islet, Japanese troops reinforced their initial landing and pressed steadily inward, pinning the Marines down under heavy fire. Shortly after dawn, one Japanese unit pushed to within striking distance of a powder magazine that had been converted into a makeshift hospital, crowded with American wounded. By 7:30 in the morning, the Marines were still holding, just barely. But Cunningham understood the arithmetic of what was coming. They might last through the day. Come nightfall, with more than 1,000 unarmed civilians on the island and no prospect of relief, the fighting would almost certainly turn into something worse than a military defeat. He conferred with Devereux and made the decision. Devereux ordered his men to destroy their weapons. A bedsheet was raised above the command post. Then Devereux set off down the road himself, accompanied by a non-commissioned officer carrying a white cloth tied to a mop handle, moving from position to position and directing each group of men to cease fire as he passed. Wake Island fell 2 days before Christmas. 122 men had died in its defense. The valor of those men was real and deserved every word of recognition it received, but it also cast a shadow over a sequence of events that had played out far from the atoll itself, events that would trouble American consciences for years afterward. 2 weeks before the final assault, a naval relief force had been dispatched from Pearl Harbor with orders to reinforce Wake. The task force was built around the aircraft carrier Saratoga, a 33,000-ton ship capable of 34 knots, carrying 72 aircraft. Its commander was Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The force got underway in time to reach Wake before the second invasion. Then it slowed. Fletcher, characteristically careful about his fuel, kept the task force company with a fleet oiler that could make no more than 13 knots. For more than 3 days, the Saratoga crept southwestward at the pace of the slowest vessel in the group. At Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral William Pye was serving as temporary commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, filling in after the relief of Admiral Kimmel following the disaster of December 7th. Pye was deeply reluctant to risk the Saratoga, one of only 3 large carriers available to the entire Pacific Fleet, in waters where her loss could be catastrophic. The deliberations that followed were agonizing and ultimately fatal to the men on Wake. At one point, Pye ordered Fletcher to race in and launch a strike. Then he reversed that order. Then he directed Fletcher to send only a seaplane tender ahead to evacuate the island. Then he cancelled that too. Finally, he ordered the task force home. No help of any kind reached Wake Island. The men who had beaten back the first invasion and fought the second one to the last possible moment had been left, through caution and indecision, entirely on their own. In the days following the destruction at Clark Field, the Philippines settled into a grim and uneven opening phase of war. Small Japanese forces came ashore on the southeastern and northern coasts of Luzon. Not the main blow, but probing landings designed to draw American attention and disperse the defense. MacArthur recognized them for what they were and refused to commit his main ground forces. Instead, he sent what remained of his diminished air arm, a mixture of P-40 fighters and the surviving B-17 heavy bombers, against the Japanese ships and transports in the waters offshore. One of those B-17 missions produced the first American hero of the Pacific War, though the story behind the heroism was more complicated than the version that reached the public. Captain Colin Kelly Jr. flew a solo bombing run on December 10th against what he and his crew believed was the Japanese battleship Haruna, operating north of Luzon. Smoke poured from the target's stern. Kelly turned for home to report a probable sinking, the kind of news that the defenders of the Philippines desperately needed and that an American public still reeling from Pearl Harbor seized upon with both hands. The truth was quieter. There were no Japanese battleships in Philippine waters that day. The vessel Kelly had attacked was likely a cruiser, and whether it sustained serious damage remains uncertain. But Kelly never made it back to Clark Field to learn any of this. On the return flight, his B-17 was bounced by Japanese Zeros. Their cannon and machine gun fire tore through the bomber and set it ablaze. Kelly held the stricken aircraft level long enough for 6 of his crewmen to parachute to safety, then went down with his plane. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously for the courage of staying with his burning aircraft while his crew escaped, and in part on the mistaken belief that he had sent the Haruna to the bottom. The main event came 12 days later, and there was nothing ambiguous about its scale. At dawn on December 22nd, 43,000 soldiers of Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army splashed ashore along the palm-fringed beaches of Lingayen Gulf, 120 miles north of Manila. These were experienced troops, many of them veterans of the fighting in China, supported by armor and artillery, and led by a commander who had campaigned on the continent. Imperial General Headquarters had given Homa 50 days to subdue all of Luzon, He had every reason to believe it was achievable. On paper, MacArthur's position did not look hopeless. He could field a force nearly 3 times the size of Homer's, but the numbers were misleading. The great bulk of his troops were Filipino reservists, 100,000 of them, who had been called up with little training, minimal equipment, and officers who had not yet learned how to lead men in combat. MacArthur had spent the years before the war trying to build an effective Filipino national army in preparation for the Commonwealth's independence due in 1946. The work had moved slowly, and the sense of urgency that might have accelerated it had never taken firm hold. His reliable strength was concentrated in a much smaller pool. The Philippine Division of the U.S. Army, including the 31st Infantry Regiment composed entirely of Americans, 12,000 Filipino scouts who were members of the U.S. Army and who would demonstrate, over the weeks ahead, a ferocious devotion to their homeland. One Philippine Army division that was genuinely combat-ready, and the 4th Regiment of U.S. Marines, which had arrived from Shanghai in November. Together, MacArthur could count on something between 25 and 30,000 soldiers he could fully trust. Homer's landing at Lingayen Gulf was met by the Northern Luzon Force under Major General Jonathan Wainwright. A few Filipino Army units fought with genuine courage, but they were overwhelmed quickly. The rest collapsed and scattered. By nightfall on the first day, Japanese tank columns were already rolling south toward Manila, and the Northern Luzon force was falling back in disarray. The situation worsened almost immediately. While Homer's men were still consolidating their Lingayen beachhead, a second Japanese amphibious force landed at Lamon Bay, roughly 70 miles southeast of Manila. The 2 invasion columns were now moving toward the capital from opposite directions, forming a giant closing pincer. On Christmas Day, Wainwright tried to anchor a defensive line along the Agno River. The Japanese 48th Division, among the most capable formations in the 14th Army, broke through it with artillery and tanks. By the evening of December 26th, Wainwright's forces were retreating again. MacArthur had already seen this moment coming. As early as December 23rd, he had made a decision to abandon Manila and pull every available force on Luzon back into Bataan, a 30-mile peninsula of mountains and jungle that jutted westward between Manila Bay and the South China Sea. Leaving the capital to Homer was painful, but from the island fortress of Corregidor at the mouth of Manila Bay, American and Filipino forces could deny the enemy the use of the harbor even after the city fell. MacArthur described the logic with characteristic bluntness. Homer might have the bottle, he said, but he had the cork. For the withdrawal to work, General Parker's Southern Luzon force, which had been fighting vigorously against the Lamon Bay landings, would need to fall back through Manila and into Bataan before the Japanese pincers could close. Manila's own gaudily painted civilian buses were pressed into military service, ferrying soldiers, supplies, and ammunition up the peninsula roads. The retreat looked like nothing so much as a fever dream. Olive-drab military vehicles and brightly colored buses tangled together in vast traffic jams, surrounded by the wooden ox carts of Filipino civilians fleeing in the same direction. Somewhere amid that moving tide, an army was trying to save itself. The sun was going down on Christmas Eve when Douglas MacArthur gathered his people on the dock below the Manila Hotel. His wife Jean was there, and their 4-year-old son Arthur, and the boy's Cantonese nursemaid, Asher. Staff officers stood nearby in the cooling air. From inside the hotel's ballroom, dinner music drifted out over the water. something formal and bright, as though the world beyond those walls had not entirely come apart. The group boarded the inter-island steamer Don Esteban for the 22-mile crossing to Corregidor, the island fortress at the entrance to Manila Bay known simply as the Rock. Behind them, the city they were leaving was already beginning to destroy itself. From the direction of the waterfront came the deep rolling sound of explosions, fuel depots and supply dumps being put to the torch to prevent them from falling into Japanese hands. To the south, at the Cavite Navy Yard, 1 million barrels of oil were burning and great columns of flame climbed into the darkened Philippine sky. Aboard the steamer, MacArthur sat apart from the others, his head in his hands. After a while, someone began to sing Silent Night. One by one, the others joined in. The withdrawal to Bataan was the most consequential military movement of the opening weeks of the war in the Pacific, and it unfolded against a clock that offered no margin for error. MacArthur had ordered General Parker south to Bataan to begin organizing the peninsula's defenses. In the days that followed, Wainwright's Northern Luzon Force and Parker's successor, Major General Albert Jones, fought a delaying action southward, trading ground for time, trying to hold the Japanese back long enough for the full army to complete the move. The last guns and trucks of the South Luzon Force crossed the Pampanga River in the early hours of New Year's Day, and the bridges behind them were blown. A few hours earlier, the Japanese had been pressing close enough that the demolition teams barely finished their work in time. By January 6th, most of MacArthur's forces on Luzon had made it into Bataan, though not all. Small detachments caught in the open during the retreat scattered into the hills and jungles and would survive there as the seeds of a guerrilla resistance. Thousands of Filipino reservists made a different calculation and simply stopped being soldiers, putting down their weapons and walking home. On January 2nd, the Japanese entered Manila. That evening, a color guard assembled under the spreading acacia trees on the lawn of the residence of the American High Commissioner. A Japanese Marine hauled down the stars and stripes and ground it beneath his heel. The regimental band played the Japanese national anthem, Kimigayo, while sunset guns boomed across the harbor and the rising sun climbed above the city. On Homer's orders, British and American civilians were gathered for internment, though otherwise they were left unharmed. The falls of Manila mattered less strategically than what had been achieved in the weeks leading up to it. The army was in Bataan, the cork was in the bottle. Whether it could hold was another question entirely, and the answer would depend on factors that were already working against the defenders before the siege had even properly begun. Bataan was a peninsula roughly 30 miles long, a landscape of wooded mountains, steep ravines and lowland jungle pressing down toward the sea on both sides. Some 15,000 American soldiers and 65,000 Filipinos were digging into its upper reaches, along with 26,000 civilian refugees who had fled ahead of the Japanese advance. The total population of the peninsula, military and civilian together, was close to 106,000 people. The stockpile of rations on hand was sufficient to feed 100,000 people for 1 month. That calculation alone told a stark story. It left aside the fact that ammunition stocks were inadequate for any kind of sustained siege, and that medical supplies, particularly quinine, the only effective treatment for malaria, were already dangerously low. Bataan's jungle swallowed sunlight and breathed moisture in the heat of the day, and in that warmth the mosquitoes were everywhere. Within days of the garrison settling in, soldiers were falling ill by the hundreds, the chills and the fever of malaria, which would eventually incapacitate thousands of men. had already begun to move through the camp. The remaining B-17 bombers had been evacuated south to Australia. The small American Asiatic fleet had withdrawn toward Java. Bataan and the guns of Corregidor were on their own. MacArthur deployed his forces across a 20-mile defensive line drawn across the upper neck of the peninsula. Wainwright's corps held the western side, with its tangled coastal terrain and precipitous bluffs. Parker's corps stretched to the swampy eastern shore. Between them rose the bulk of 4,200-foot Mount Natib, its slopes so steep and its ravines so dense with growth that maintaining reliable contact between the two corps was essentially impossible. The line existed on paper as a continuous front. In practice, it had a gap at its center that no one could adequately defend. The Japanese, meanwhile, were so confident of quick victory that Homer's commanders allowed his best division, the veteran 48th, to be pulled out of the Philippines and reassigned to the upcoming invasion of Java. In its place came the 65th Brigade, composed mostly of conscripts who had barely completed a month of training. That substitution would matter, but it would not be enough to change the outcome, only to delay it and to extract a price that the Japanese had not expected to pay. The Japanese offensive against Bataan opened on January 9th with an artillery barrage that shook the ground across the northern end of the peninsula. The guns were still reverberating when Parker's position on the eastern half of the line came under infantry attack 2 days later. The Japanese preferred to attack in the evening hours, and that is precisely when they came. At dusk on January 11th, soldiers moving through the gathering dark, shouting as they charged the barbed wire protecting the American and Filipino positions. Some of them threw themselves across the wire deliberately, using their own bodies to flatten it so that the men coming behind them could cross. The first assault was thrown back. 300 Japanese soldiers were killed in the attempt. 2 weeks of sustained fighting followed along the length of the front. Both sides used tanks and artillery. The Americans and Filipinos pushed back where they could, yielded where they had to, and managed to hold the line against formations that, for all the confidence behind them, were proving less formidable than Homer's planners had anticipated. The 65th Brigade, those partially trained conscripts sent to replace the veteran 48th Division, was not the weapon the Japanese needed for this kind of close, grinding combat in jungle terrain. But Japanese control of the air was total and uncontested, and in the end it was a flanking movement rather than a frontal assault that threatened to undo the defense. 2 of Homer's best regiments worked their way down the steep slopes of Mount Natib, driving through the gap between Wainwright's and Parker's corps that the mountain itself had made almost impossible to close. By advancing down that central corridor, they began to turn both corps inward, threatening to cut off the route south before either force could withdraw. MacArthur ordered a retreat to a new defensive line halfway down the peninsula. The withdrawal was disorganized in the way that retreats under pressure always are. Soldiers scrambled across rocky beaches and pulled themselves through jungle ravines, the few passable roads filled with a slow, battered procession of buses and trucks and men on foot. By January 25th, when the last elements of the American rearguard staggered into new positions, they had the look of men on the far side of something. An officer who watched them described their faces as stripped of any expression, as though, he wrote, the men were already ghosts of themselves. Even as they fell back, a new threat opened behind them. The Japanese mounted 4 amphibious landings at narrow points along the southwestern coast of Bataan, attempting to get in behind the retreating army. The areas targeted were lightly defended by an improvised collection of service troops, sailors who had lost their ships, airmen who had lost their planes, Marines, Philippine constabulary. Rather than trained infantry, rapid reinforcement by the Filipino scouts contained the landings before they could expand. Over the days that followed, the Japanese were gradually pushed back to the beaches where they had come ashore. The endgame for the Japanese coastal force was a study in how that war would be fought across the Pacific for the next 3.5 years. Cornered in cliffside caves above the waterline, the Japanese refused to surrender. They were eventually destroyed by a combination of PT boat fire from offshore and demolition charges dropped from above by Filipino scouts. The lesson that American and Filipino soldiers were learning, that the Japanese soldier would accept death before capitulation, regardless of the tactical circumstances, was one that would need to be relearned in blood on many other islands before the war was done. By mid-February, the amphibious threat had been eliminated. The new defensive line was holding, and Homer, surveying his situation at the second week of February, had arrived at a difficult conclusion. He had used up more than his allotted 50 days. He had lost over 7,000 men killed or wounded on Bataan. Another 10,000 to 12,000 of his soldiers were down with malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, or beriberi. His own army was weakening, and across the wire the stubborn garrison still held half the peninsula. He pulled his exhausted forces back a few miles and sent word to Tokyo asking for reinforcements. A lull settled over the front, nearly 2 months of relative quiet, during which the American and Filipino defenders laid minefields, reorganized their artillery, and tried to recover some measure of strength. The Japanese, for once, were not pushing. The danger during that lull, however, had not gone away. What had changed was its source. The Japanese guns had paused. The jungle itself had not. The lull in Japanese pressure brought no real relief. While Homer regrouped and waited for reinforcements, the garrison on Bataan faced an enemy that could not be held at gunpoint or turned back with artillery. Sickness and starvation were moving through the ranks with a patience and thoroughness that no military defense could slow. The quinine supply had nearly run out, and without it the malaria that Bataan's jungle heat and mosquitoes made almost inevitable became a catastrophic drain on fighting strength. 1,000 men a day were falling out of the line with chills, fever, and the particular exhaustion of bodies that had been fighting illness while eating almost nothing. Rations had been cut in half, and then cut again. By the end of March, a soldier's daily allotment amounted to 8 or 10 ounces of rice and an ounce or 2 of fish or canned meat. In some units, officers found themselves restraining men from eating the rotting flesh of animals that had died nearby. The men who had come to Bataan looking like soldiers were beginning to look like something else. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that the jungle was slowly consuming. Washington understood that the garrison needed resupply, and attempts were made. Japan had by then seized key bases across the southern Philippines, and its navy patrolled the sea lanes between Bataan and the nearest Allied territory. Despite elaborate and sometimes genuinely dangerous efforts to run the blockade, and the occasional submarine surfacing at Mindanao or Corregidor with a load of food or ammunition, only 3 supply ships reached the Philippines during the entire siege. The men on Bataan began calling themselves, with the dark humor that soldiers cultivate against despair, the battling bastards of Bataan. The phrase acknowledged what they understood plainly: they were on their own. The Japanese resumed pressure even during the lull. though through means that were harder to fight than frontal assaults. Small groups of enemy soldiers slipped through the lines in ones and twos, reassembled deep in the jungle behind the American positions, and spent their time disrupting supply lines, ambushing patrols, burning stockpiles, and stealing food and weapons. Soldiers sleeping in what seemed like secure camps woke to find men beside them had been killed silently in the night. Capture for any American or Filipino unlucky enough to be taken meant execution. The psychological weight of this, fighting an enemy who might be anywhere, sleeping amid an uncertainty that was impossible to resolve, compounded the physical misery of hunger and fever into something close to collective despair. Morale had surged briefly when the Japanese offensive stalled in February. That surge was gone now. A radio address by President Roosevelt on February 23rd, presumably intended to hearten the troops, had instead confirmed what the men on Bataan had begun to fear most. There was no prospect of reinforcement. Help was not coming. The battle would be fought with what they had, and what they had was running out. Meanwhile, on fortified Corregidor, MacArthur had earned a nickname among the starving men on the peninsula across the water. They called him Dugordag, a reference to the relative safety of his headquarters in Malinta Tunnel compared to the open hellscape of Bataan. The name carried contempt in it, and the events that followed did nothing to soften that feeling. MacArthur had genuinely intended to stay. He had resisted pressure from Washington to leave for weeks, prepared to be captured or to die on the rock. Then, in late February, President Roosevelt made the decision for him. MacArthur was ordered to Australia to assume command of the Allied forces assembling there for an eventual counteroffensive. He could not refuse a direct presidential order, and he knew it. On March 10th, he summoned Wainwright, told him of the order, and assigned him command of the Luzon forces. "If I get through to Australia," MacArthur told him, "I'll come back as soon as I can with as much as I can." The following evening, MacArthur, his family, and a group of staff officers boarded 4 PT boats rocking alongside Corregidor's concrete pier. Aboard PT-41, he turned to the skipper, Lieutenant John Bulkley, bearded, broad-shouldered with 2 pistols on his hips, and gave the order to cast off. As the boats eased through the minefields guarding the harbour entrance and turned toward open sea, MacArthur raised his cap to the people watching from the dock. The boats carried MacArthur and his party 500 miles south to Mindanao, and from there a B-17 flew him 1,600 miles further to Darwin, Australia. On the long train journey south to Melbourne, a message reached him from General George Marshall. No American infantry divisions had yet been dispatched to Australia. No tanks, no heavy weapons. The Allied aircraft in the country were being steadily destroyed by Japanese attacks. Australia itself was in such danger of invasion that 2 of its divisions were being recalled from the Middle East. MacArthur absorbed all of this in silence. "God have mercy on us," he murmured. An hour later, he stood before reporters and read a short, hard-edged statement. He had come to Australia, he said, to organize the American offensive against Japan. He ended with the words that would define the rest of the Pacific War for him, a pledge issued to a continent he barely knew on behalf of a battle still being lost. "I came through," MacArthur said, "and I shall return." By the end of March, the army MacArthur had left behind was barely recognizable as a fighting force. Of the roughly 80,000 defenders who had entered Bataan in January, fewer than a quarter were still capable of sustained combat. The rest were sick, starving, or both. 1,000 men a day were falling out of the line with malaria alone. daily rations had been reduced to 8 or 10 ounces of rice and an ounce or two of canned meat or fish. Officers struggled to prevent men from eating the rotted flesh of dead animals. Washington had made efforts to resupply the garrison, but the sea lanes were controlled by Japan's navy and only 3 supply ships had managed to get through. The men on Bataan called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan. The phrase carried the sardonic weight of men who had been abandoned and knew it. Homer, meanwhile, had received his reinforcements. 21,000 fresh troops had arrived, along with 150 new field guns and 60 bombers. Tokyo had also replaced 3 of his senior staff officers, a signal of impatience that the Japanese command made no effort to conceal. On the morning of April 3rd, Good Friday on one side of the wire, the anniversary of the death of the legendary Emperor Jimmu on the other, the stalemate ended. The Japanese launched a 5-hour air and artillery bombardment, the heaviest of the entire campaign. The jungle was scorched. Carefully built defensive positions were reduced to twisted debris. Then the armor and infantry went in, crashing into the center of the American line. Dazed and disoriented by the ferocity of what had just fallen on them, the defenders gave ground, tried to hold, then gave more ground. The bombardment resumed the following day, and on Easter Sunday the Japanese seized their first major objective, the commanding heights of 1,800-foot Mount Samat. From that ridge they could see the entire battlefield below them. 2 Philippine Army divisions had been obliterated. General Parker's corps was in danger of being driven straight into Manila Bay. Major General Edward King Jr., who had assumed command on Bataan when Wainwright moved to Corregidor, threw nearly everything he had left into a counterattack, including the prized 31st Infantry Regiment. The emaciated soldiers who went forward had almost no strength left to give. By nightfall, the roads leading south through the peninsula were clogged with thousands of Americans and Filipinos falling back from the line, Japanese tanks pressing close behind them, and Zero fighters sweeping in on strafing runs that met no opposition at all. Demolition teams at Mariveles, on Bataan's southern tip, began destroying the last ammunition stockpiles and setting fuel afire. Some 2,000 people, among them 104 army nurses, managed to escape to Corregidor by small boat and barge. From Corregidor, Wainwright, under explicit orders from MacArthur, called for a final counterattack. King, standing in the wreckage of the front, looked at what was left of his army and decided against it. At 11 o'clock on the morning of April 9th, 6 days after the final Japanese offensive began, King sat down across a field table from Homer's operations officer, Colonel Moto Nakayama. He asked for a 12-hour pause to collect his wounded. Nakayama refused without hesitation. "Will our troops be well treated?" King asked. "We are not barbarians," Nakayama replied. King unstrapped his sidearm and laid it on the table. He surrendered 76,000 men. On Corregidor, the garrison still held. The island's defensive architecture was formidable. Malinta Tunnel, a network of concrete-reinforced bomb-proof underground passages, served simultaneously as headquarters, communication center, ammunition storage, hospital, and shelter. The surface of the island bristled with coastal guns and mortars, 56 weapons in all, supplemented by massive 14-inch guns on 3 neighboring islands. One of those islands, Fort Drum, had been encased so thoroughly in concrete that it resembled an enormous pillbox rising from the sea. The men there called it the concrete battleship. None of it was enough. For nearly a month, 13,000 Americans and Filipinos endured an almost continuous artillery barrage. More than 100 Japanese guns fired day and night. The shelling was so sustained, so unrelenting in its rhythm, that survivors later said it felt less like artillery than like some enormous mechanical thing grinding without pause. Fires burned across the surface of the island until the ground itself was charred black. The concrete walls of Malaya Tunnel developed widening cracks. Dust and the smell of death were constant. One by one, the rock's own guns, most of them in open emplacements where they were vulnerable to plunging fire, fell silent. Constant exposure to gunfire, destruction and death altered our sense of values drastically, one survivor wrote afterward. We asked only to live from day to day, a full meal, a bath, a chance to sleep under a bomb-proof roof. These were the essentials. On May 2nd, a direct hit struck Corregidor's last large gun emplacement in its magazine. 10-ton mortar barrels were hurled into the air. The explosion shook the fortress to its foundations. 3 nights later, Japanese troops came ashore on Corregidor. Within 4 hours, they were less than a mile from the mouth of Malaya Tunnel. Tanks rolled onto the island. The last defensive line, manned in part by 500 sailors fighting as infantry, was falling apart. Shortly before noon on May 6th, General Wainwright composed a cable to President Roosevelt. "With broken heart," he wrote, "and head bowed in sadness but not in shame, I report to Your Excellency that today I must arrange terms for the surrender of the fortified islands of Manila Bay." He also sent a message to MacArthur in Australia. "I have fought for you to the best of my ability from Lingayen Gulf to Bataan to Corregidor. Goodbye, General." The last message to leave Corregidor was tapped out by Corporal Irving Strobing, a radio operator from Brooklyn. "Everyone is bawling like a baby," he sent. "They are piling dead and wounded in our tunnel. The jig is up." General Wainwright crossed to the Japanese lines under a white flag. What followed was not simply the formal surrender of a fortress island. Homer laid out his requirements before any ceasefire could take hold. Wainwright must surrender not only Corregidor, but every American and Filipino military force remaining anywhere in the Philippine archipelago. It was a demand that placed Wainwright in genuine and painful conflict with himself. The commands on Mindanao and across the other southern islands had not been defeated. Their soldiers were still armed, still organized, still prepared to resist, as conventional forces if they could, as guerrillas in the hills if they had to, surrendering them from a table on Corregidor on the authority of a general who had no communication with them and no knowledge of their current circumstances, felt to Wainwright like a betrayal of men who had not given up. He argued, he delayed, but Homer held firm, and the terms were not negotiable. No ceasefire for anyone unless the order covered everyone. What broke the deadlock in the end was not strategy but humanity. Malaya Tunnel contained nurses, wounded soldiers and civilians who had no other shelter and no means of escape. If the fighting continued, if Wainwright refused and the Japanese renewed their assault, the tunnel would become a killing ground for people who had never held a weapon. That prospect was more than he could bear. He capitulated. The following day, Wainwright broadcast the surrender order over Japanese-controlled radio from Manila, directing every remaining American and Filipino unit in the Philippines to lay down its arms. It was a transmission that carried the full weight of military authority behind words that no commander speaks willingly. Over the 5 weeks that followed, the isolated commands complied, slowly, bitterly, some of their officers weeping as the moment came. One by one, across Mindanao and Cebu and the smaller islands to the south, the last fires of organized resistance were extinguished. Almost all of them. In the confusion of the final days, several thousand soldiers, American and Filipino, chose a different course, slipping away from their units before the surrender orders reached them. They moved into the mountains and dense jungle of the interior and disappeared. They carried what weapons they could, and they carried something more durable than weapons, the knowledge of the terrain, the trust of local communities who resented the Japanese occupation, and the hard, practical experience of soldiers who had been fighting for months. In the years ahead, these men would organize resistance networks, gather intelligence, ambush Japanese convoys on mountain roads, and transmit information to Allied commands operating from thousands of miles away. Japan would never fully pacify the Philippines. The hills would never go entirely quiet. For the men who had fought the long siege on Bataan and endured the final weeks on Corregidor, the fall of the Philippines was a defeat that carried a specific and lasting bitterness. They had been abandoned. They understood the logic that placed the preservation of the fleet and the preparation of a long-term counter-offensive above the relief of a garrison that probably could not be saved in any case. Understanding the logic did not dull the anger. The men on Bataan had held far longer than anyone had reason to expect. They had inflicted casualties on Homer's army that exceeded every projection the Japanese High Command had made. Homer had been given 50 days to take Luzon. It had taken him nearly 5 months, and the campaign had consumed his army's strength and reputation in ways that would shadow his career until its end. None of that softened the hunger or the fever, or what awaited those men as prisoners of the Japanese in the months that followed. Across the Philippines, the rising sun now flew from Luzon to Mindanao. The harbor at Manila served Japanese vessels. The airfields that had been built and operated at American expense now launched Japanese aircraft. 3 months had passed since the war began. In that time, Japan had dismantled American power in the Western Pacific more completely and more swiftly than even its most optimistic planners had dared to envision. The picket line was taking shape. The cascade of conquest was still running, moving south and west toward the oil fields and the distant shores that Japan intended to make its own. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita was not, by temperament or reputation, a man much given to poetry. He was hard and direct and practical, a soldier's soldier in the most unadorned sense of the phrase. Yet in the early hours of December 4th, 1941, as 19 transport ships carrying the troops of his command moved out of harbor on the morning tide, Yamashita stepped outside his cabin aboard the Ryujo Maru and looked up at the sky. The sun had cleared the horizon. The moon had not yet set. Both hung in the air at once, and something about their shared presence struck him as portentous. Standing on the deck in the pre-dawn quiet, he composed a short poem to mark the moment. His devoted aides somehow failed to preserve it for history. What they could not fail to preserve was what followed, 6 months of military success so consecutive and so sweeping that the poem, whatever it said, would have seemed almost modest in retrospect. The objective before Yamashita was Southeast Asia in its entirety. Indochina had already passed into Japanese control in 1941, surrendered without serious resistance by a France that no longer had the strength to protect its distant possessions. From that base, Japan's southern strategy now unfolded in a series of interconnected moves. Yamashita's operation called for the occupation of Thailand, then a sustained drive down through the jungle-covered Malay Peninsula towards Singapore, Britain's most powerful stronghold east of Suez and the central pillar of Western military prestige in Asia. Simultaneously, Japanese air and naval forces would launch a massive assault against the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, and once those objectives were secured, the campaign would conclude with the expulsion of the British from Burma, removing the last overland supply route into China and potentially strangling that country's resistance once and for all. It was an enormous design. Yamashita's share of it was the most symbolically significant piece. His convoy had set out from the island of Hainan off the southern Chinese coast and had to cover 1,100 miles of open ocean before reaching its destination. 3 small fishing ports on the eastern shore of the Kra Isthmus, a narrow strip of land where southern Thailand meets the northern border of Malaya. The crossing was estimated to take 4 days. The ship steamed south across the South China Sea, picking up an escort of Japanese warships off the southern tip of Indochina, then swinging westward into the Gulf of Siam. Luck favored the convoy almost from the start. On December 6th, the day after the rendezvous with the warship escort, a British Hudson bomber on patrol out of the airbase at Kota Bharu spotted the Japanese fleet. The pilot was operating at the outermost limit of his range and could not linger. He returned to base and reported what he had seen: merchant ships, apparently accompanied by Japanese cruisers and destroyers, moving on various headings. The report was relayed 350 miles down the peninsula to British Far East Command headquarters in Singapore, where it arrived and was analysed, and where uncertainty took over. The ships were clearly moving. Toward what? Bangkok, perhaps. Or Singora, a port in southern Thailand near the Malayan frontier. Or directly toward the northern Malayan coast near Kota Bharu. Possibly all 3. Thailand was a delicate subject. Alone among the nations of Southeast Asia, it had managed to preserve its formal independence, not an appendage of any colonial power, a neutrality that the British were reluctant to violate. A British contingency plan called Matador had been drawn up for precisely this moment. It envisioned sending British troops into southern Thailand to seize the port of Singora before the Japanese could land there. But London had urged caution at every turn, and the local high command was hesitant. Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, commanding all British forces in the Far East, responded to the sightings by raising readiness levels and increasing reconnaissance flights. He did not invoke Matador. The weather on December 7th worked in Yamashita's favour, squalls and driving rain that severely hampered visibility from the air. Not until evening did British patrols spot the Japanese vessels again, some heading towards Singora at 5:30, others toward Patani and Kota Bharu an hour later. The full invasion pattern was finally clear. But the sightings did not reach Far East Command in Singapore until 9 o'clock at night. By then, the Japanese transports were already dropping anchor off the invasion beaches. Royal Air Force aircraft were scrambled towards Singora and struck 3 of the transports, setting 2 ablaze and sinking a 3rd. It made no difference. The 5,300 Japanese soldiers assigned to Singora had already gone ashore. Brooke Popham's delayed decision on Matador came too late for the plan to serve any purpose, The battalion of infantry he sent toward a key ridge inside Thailand was held up at the frontier by Thai police, was then attacked by Japanese forces before reaching its objective and retreated. Patani fell without resistance. At Kota Bharu the fighting was harder. The Japanese came ashore under withering machine gun fire from pillbox fortifications behind the beach, taking heavy casualties. One Japanese soldier threw himself across a pillbox slit, blinding it long enough for his comrades to charge with grenades and bayonets. The mine-sown fields between the beach and the airfield were crossed by soldiers willing to detonate the charges with their own bodies to clear the way for those behind them. By afternoon, Japanese aircraft flying in from Indochina were pounding the base from above. At around 4 o'clock, a false rumor reached the British defenders that Japanese ground troops had broken through the perimeter. A panicked evacuation began. Buildings were set afire, the operations room destroyed, stores burned, but in the rush, the runway was left intact and the remaining fuel and bombs were abandoned in place. Within 24 hours of the first landings, Kota Bharu and its airfield were entirely in Japanese hands. Yamashita had made his start. The Malay Peninsula lay before him. The bombing of Singapore on the morning of December 8th should have shattered the myths. It did not. 17 Japanese Navy bombers roared in over the city's airfields while Singapore still blazed with lights. The city was a late-night place, and near dawn it remained brightly illuminated. The bombs killed roughly 200 people, mostly Chinese merchants and Sikh night watchmen, and destroyed numerous buildings in the congested center of town. An English businesswoman watching from her flat window called the police as the explosions walked toward her. She was told calmly that it was only a practice. She replied that they were overdoing it considerably and hung up. The anti-aircraft gunners were so poorly trained that British commanders chose not to send up the night fighters for fear they would be shot down by their own side. Civilian defense offices were not staffed. The sirens sounded only after the bombers had already gone. The keeper of the master switches for the city street lighting could not be found, and the lamps burned on through the whole attack and well beyond it. Singapore's European residents concluded that the raid had been a fluke. The island was, after all, an impregnable fortress. Everyone said so. The comparison to Gibraltar was commonplace in the clubs and drawing rooms of the colonial elite. Life in that privileged tropical enclave had been comfortable for a very long time, and comfort tends to calcify into certainty. The Japanese, the comfortable certainty went, were militarily inferior in every meaningful sense. Their ships were poorly built. Their aircraft were copies of Western designs. Their soldiers could not shoot accurately because of some supposed deficiency in their vision. The fact that Japanese forces appeared to be bogged down in China was presented as proof of Japanese incompetence rather than of the tenacity of Chinese resistance. These were not fringe opinions. They were gospel recited in the whites-only clubs with the breezy confidence of people who had never needed to examine what they believed. Three days after the city was bombed, those beliefs were permanently dismantled, not in a club or a conference room, but at sea. On the evening of December 8th, a flotilla of British warships slipped out of Singapore's hastily developed naval base and turned north. The mission was bold in its conception: find the Japanese invasion fleet off the Craisigmas and destroy it, severing the enemy's supply line and bringing the assault on Malaya to a halt before it could properly begin. The task force consisted of 4 destroyers and 2 capital ships, the 32,000-ton battlecruiser Repulse, a veteran of the First World War rebuilt so extensively that the Navy nicknamed her HMS Repair, and the 35,000-ton battleship Prince of Wales, the pride of the Royal Navy, the same ship on which Prime Minister Churchill had crossed the Atlantic to meet with President Roosevelt the previous August. In command was Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, small in stature, enormous in self-assurance, a man who had spent 38 of his 53 years in the Navy and had repeatedly dismissed the growing argument that sea power could be negated by air power. But even Phillips understood the conditions his plan required. He needed surprise. And as he approached Singora, where most of the Japanese transports were concentrated, he needed fighter cover over his ships. The task force had barely cleared harbor when the first problem arrived. The airfields of northern Malaya had been knocked out, and fighter protection on the planned date of action would not, the message said, be possible. Phillips shrugged. They would go on without it. Surprise was also already lost, though Phillips did not know it yet. A Japanese submarine had tracked the task force for most of the previous day, reporting its position and course. When cloud cover broke in the late afternoon and 3 Japanese aircraft appeared briefly in the distance, Phillips concluded that his presence was known and turned the task force back towards Singapore. It was already too late. Japanese Naval Command in Indochina was organizing an attack. En route south, Phillips received a report that Japanese troops had landed at the port of Kuantan, halfway down the Malayan coast. He turned toward it. The next morning, a destroyer sent into Kuantan harbor signaled back that all was quiet. The reported landing had turned out to be a herd of water buffalo that had stumbled into a coastal minefield, and the noise had panicked the local garrison into sending an alarm. The task force had been delayed for nothing, sitting in waters it should have already left. At 10:20 on the morning of December 10th, a shadowing aircraft was spotted. The crews went to battle stations. At 11 o'clock, 9 Japanese Navy bombers came in from the north. The Repulse and the Prince of Wales began taking evasive action, their guns throwing up a barrage so dense that the shell splashes on the sea surface looked, to one Japanese pilot overhead, like sand being scattered across the water. The bombers held formation through it all, concentrating on the Repulse. One bomb struck her amidships. 2 others grazed her sides. Fires broke out in several places. Cecil Brown, an American radio correspondent on board, heard a British gunner mutter, in a tone that mixed professional respect with personal alarm, that it was bloody good bombing for those blokes. Then came the torpedo planes, 9 of them flying low. The Repulse evaded by zigzagging hard, and the torpedoes passed her by. A quarter-mile away, the Prince of Wales was not so fortunate. 2 torpedoes struck her port side simultaneously. Both port propeller shafts were knocked out, and the steering failed. A signal flashed to the Repulse, not under control. As the great ship began listing and the Repulse moved in close to assist, 9 more torpedo planes appeared. 3 more torpedoes tore into the Prince of Wales, 5 struck the Repulse. One of them jammed the Repulse's rudder, and she too lost steerage. Captain William Tennant ordered all hands to the deck and the lifeboats down. "Good luck and God be with you," he told his men. Officers seized the captain and forced him over the side along with everyone else. At 12:33 in the afternoon, the Repulse heeled over at roughly 70 degrees, rolled and slid beneath the surface. New waves of bombers circled the Prince of Wales as she wallowed in a widening oil slick, sending up great columns of smoke. At 1:15, the last bomb landed. The ship shuddered as though struck by something inconceivably heavy. On the bridge, Admiral Phillips and the ship's captain, John Leach, stood side by side, upright and unmoving. They were still there 5 minutes later when the Prince of Wales heeled over and went down. 11 Royal Air Force fighters arrived from Singapore just after she sank, dispatched when the distress signal finally got through, too late for anything but circling over the wreckage. The pilots looked down at hundreds of oil-blackened men in the water, clinging to debris or paddling in the slick, many of them giving a thumbs up to the aircraft overhead as they waited for the destroyers. 2,081 men were rescued. 820 were not. Of the 88 Japanese aircraft involved in the attack, 4 had been shot down. In London, the news reached Churchill in bed. First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound telephoned with the report, his voice stricken. Churchill would later write that he was grateful to be alone when the full weight of what he had been told settled upon him. In all the war, he said, no news had struck him with a more direct shock. Japan now commanded the seas across a vast expanse of ocean, and everywhere the British turned, they found themselves weak and exposed. Within 4 days of the war's opening, Japanese bombers had destroyed most of Britain's air power in Malaya. The Repulse and the Prince of Wales were gone, lying in 300 feet of water off the Malayan coast. The way south through the peninsula lay open, and Yamashita intended to move through it fast enough to keep the British from recovering any equilibrium at all. The numbers on their face suggested a contest. For the conquest of Malaya, Yamashita had 60,000 troops to deploy against 88,000 British. What the numbers concealed was the difference in the two forces' actual fighting capacity. The British Army in Malaya was, in the blunt assessment of most who examined it, a collection assembled in haste and underprepared for the theatre in which it was fighting. Australian, British, Indian and Malayan units had been thrown together with inadequate training, insufficient equipment, and in several cases a serious shortage of competent junior leadership. Many of the Indian division's experienced non-coms and officers had been sent back to India to train new recruits, leaving their units without the experienced backbone that combat requires. The equipment situation was stark. Tanks were almost entirely absent from British Malaya. Artillery was in short supply. Communications gear was inadequate. The tools and spare parts needed to maintain the machinery they did have were limited. And the tactical framework that the British Army had brought with it was calibrated for European conditions. A different landscape, a different climate, a different enemy. The British soldier in Malaya was laden with everything the European model demanded: pack, haversack, blanket, gas mask, canned rations. He was, as one sardonic observer noted, dressed like a Christmas tree. He was trained for open fields and roads and defensible positions with clear lines of fire. Yamashita's soldier needed none of that. He moved on a few handfuls of rice and pickled vegetables. His equipment was light. His clothing was designed for heat and rain. And he had been rehearsing for exactly this terrain. The jungles and rubber estates of Hainan and Indochina had served as his training ground. Many of his men had fought in China before coming to Malaya and understood instinctively how to navigate environments where the standard rules of conventional warfare dissolved. The Japanese method on the ground was simple, fast, and consistently effective. When they encountered a British defensive position on a road, their tanks would close in while infantry dismounted and melted off the road into the jungle on either side, moving through the undergrowth in small groups, following narrow animal tracks or poling down swamp waterways on crude rafts. They would work around the flanks and reassemble behind the British position. Then they would set off fireworks, firecrackers, and other noisemakers, a cacophony in the jungle dark that convinced the defenders they were surrounded by a much larger force. The tanks would then drive into the resulting confusion, sometimes catching British reinforcement columns still moving in column on the road and inflicting heavy losses. And then there were the bicycles. Malaya had been one of Japan's better export markets for bicycles before the war, which meant that interchangeable parts were available in almost every village. Japanese soldiers frequently preceded their tank columns on bicycles, scouting roads ahead at speed. When enemy positions were overrun, bicyclists pedaled forward ahead of the armor, maintaining pressure on retreating units before they could regroup. Swollen rivers without bridges were forded with bicycles raised overhead. It was unglamorous and utterly practical, and it helped maintain a pace of advance that the British could not match. The British soldiers, repeatedly driven off roads and into the jungle, found the terrain itself as terrifying as the enemy. The heat was suffocating. Leeches dropped from leaves and fastened to exposed skin. Thorned vines snagged at every step. Visibility collapsed to a few feet in every direction, making it impossible to know where help was or where the enemy might be. The jungle's silence, broken only by animal sounds and the distant echo of gunfire, created a psychological weight of its own. A British colonel who visited an Indian unit during the retreat described the men as thoroughly depressed, the natural silence of the jungle amplifying their anxiety until it became something close to dread. By the middle of January, Yamashita controlled 2/3 of the Malay Peninsula. General Wavell, the supreme Allied commander in the Far East, flew in to assess the situation and ordered a full withdrawal to Johore, the southernmost state of Malaya, separated from Singapore by a shallow tidal channel less than a mile wide at most points. The ground commander in Malaya, Lieutenant General A.E. Percival, had wanted to continue fighting a measured delaying action down the rest of the peninsula, buying time for reinforcements to reach Singapore. Wavell overrode him. The fighting in Johore burned for 2 weeks. At first it seemed to shift slightly toward the defenders. Yamashita's supply line had been stretched almost to the point of breaking. His soldiers were short of ammunition and food, and many were sick. The 8th Australian Division, held in reserve throughout the Peninsula Campaign, was committed to battle and fought with an aggression the Japanese had not expected, abandoning static defense to set ambushes and infiltrate enemy lines, returning to the Japanese some of what that army had been dispensing for weeks. The Australians and Indian troops who had been pulled back from the north fought a particularly brutal battle in the jungle around the Malay River against the Japanese Imperial Guards, elite soldiers who viewed their opponents as already defeated. The British rushed 51 Hurricane fighters from England to support the fight at the Malaya, but the Hurricanes proved too slow and too heavy for the nimble Zeros they were asked to engage. In the end, the 4,500 defenders of the Malaya area were overwhelmed piecemeal, chewed up by superior numbers despite holding out for 2 weeks. About 900 managed to escape southward. The Imperial Guards, having expected to annihilate the entire force and feeling they had been denied a complete victory, acted on that resentment in a manner that defined the cruelty of the Pacific War. They systematically executed 200 wounded Australians and Indians who had been left behind because the men retreating with them could not carry them through the jungle. The Japanese eventually breached the Johor front and threatened to encircle the defenders. The order to withdraw came down, and the weary remnant of the British force in Malaya began its final exodus towards Singapore. Before pulling back, the Australians caught 2 Japanese infantry companies marching in compact formation and killed most of them from concealed positions, a small, cold satisfaction at the end of a long and costly retreat. On the morning of January 31st, the last British battalion on the Malayan mainland, 90 men of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, grimy and hollowed out, crossed the causeway linking Johor to Singapore Island. 2 pipers played them across. When the last man was over, British engineers detonated the demolition charges they had set in the causeway's supports, and the waters of Johor Strait poured through a 60-yard gap in the concrete. Singapore was now an island under siege. Singapore was burning before the assault even began. On the northeastern corner of the island, the vast naval base that had taken 15 years and tens of millions of pounds to construct stood silent and empty beneath the smoke of 2 enormous fires set by the British themselves before the last troops crossed the causeway. On the southern waterfront, the smell of burning rubber drifted through the streets of Singapore town, where supplies were being destroyed to prevent them from becoming Japanese spoils. The island's population, swollen to more than 1 million people, crammed into an area that had supported roughly half that number in peacetime, existed in a state of barely controlled terror. Yamashita had used the week after the Johor Strait crossing to prepare. Thanks partly to Japanese nationals who had worked on rubber estates in the region before the war and knew the roads, excellent routes had been cut right down to the northern shore of the strait. Over them came a steady stream of artillery and 200 collapsible boats that would carry the assault troops across the water. At 11 o'clock on the night of February 8th, 440 Japanese guns opened simultaneously. The barrage was massive and deliberate, and under its cover the first wave of Japanese troops climbed into their boats and began crossing the mangrove-fringed northwestern shore of Singapore Island. The soldiers who received the brunt of this first assault were 2 Australian battalions that had arrived from home only recently, with no combat experience. The Japanese attacked from multiple directions at once, driving through the defenders and cutting around their flanks, exactly as they had done again and again down the length of Malaya. In the darkness, among the unfamiliar tangle of mangrove channels and swamp, units separated and could not find one another. Death came at the Australians from directions that made no sense. By dawn, those who had survived were in flight. A gunner signaller at Tenga Airfield, north of Singapore town, watched some of them come past in the early morning light. They were moving at a half run, he said, panic on their faces, many of them wearing only shorts, most without boots, their feet already cut open by the ground. They had thrown away their rifles. They were panting, incoherent. A rabble. By noon that day, roughly 23,000 Japanese soldiers were on Singapore Island and pushing toward Bukit Timah, a 600-foot hill that commanded the entire island. A British counterattack failed when communications broke down. Over the next 4 days, Japanese engineers repaired the gap in the Johora Causeway and brought tanks across. Singapore town endured continuous bombing around the clock. Streets filled with downed power lines, shattered telephone poles, overturned trams, and the smell of bodies left uncollected in the heat. More than 1 million people were penned into 3 square miles. Water was vanishing. For every 6 gallons pumped into the city's reservoirs, 5 poured out through ruptured mains and broken pipes. Armed deserters looted what remained of the shops, stuffing their clothes with cigarettes and food against the coming collapse. A military hospital at Alexandra had been broken into by Japanese soldiers who had then run amok inside, bayoneting patients in their beds and killing members of the medical staff, more than 300 people dead in a building flying the Red Cross. Witnesses who escaped spread the story, and it spread the panic further. On the morning of February 13th, a Japanese aircraft dropped a message from General Yamashita onto British headquarters at Fort Canning. It was phrased with elaborate courtesy, praising British gallantry and warrior spirit, and demanding surrender. General Percival cabled the contents to Wavell and indicated that he did not intend to reply. 2 days later, the situation had worsened beyond any honest argument for continued resistance. On Sunday the 15th, Percival convened a conference in the bomb-proof briefing room beneath Fort Canning. With him were his senior commanders, including Australian Major General Henry Gordon Bennett. They assessed the island's position in silence. Water for perhaps another day or 2. Ammunition running out. No prospect of relief. They reached their conclusion without ceremony. Silently and sadly, Bennett recalled, "We decided to surrender." Wartig. That afternoon, Percival drove to the Ford Motor Company's bomb-damaged assembly plant on the slope of Bukit Timah to meet Yamashita. The 2 men sat across a bare table. Percival asked for time overnight, to seek approval from above, presumably. Yamashita, broad and expressionless, said the fighting would continue unless Percival agreed immediately. The British general hesitated. "Yes or no?" Yamashita asked. Percival lowered his head and whispered his answer. At 8:30 that evening, the guns fell silent. Japanese soldiers across the island began singing their national anthem. At his headquarters, Yamashita gathered his staff for the traditional victory celebration of dried cuttlefish, chestnuts and sake. The officers stood and raised their cups toward the northeast, in the direction of Tokyo. Yamashita, who would carry the name the Tiger of Malaya for the rest of his life, had completed in 70 days a campaign he had estimated would take 100. The British had suffered 138,000 casualties against Japanese losses of under 10,000. The proudest British fortress in Asia had fallen, and with it the last credible argument that European power in the East was anything other than a historical accident drawing toward its close. Meanwhile, the conquest of Hong Kong, overrun by superior Japanese forces from the Chinese mainland and surrendered on Christmas Day 1941, had already removed Britain's other great Asian possession. Both of Britain's eastern jewels were gone. Singapore's fall handed Japan something more than a military victory and a symbolic prize. It gave Japan absolute control of the Malay Peninsula and all the resources beneath its surface: tin, iron, gold, bauxite, rubber, and it brought Japanese forces to within 65 miles of Sumatra, the second largest island in the Dutch East Indies and the site of some of the richest petroleum deposits in Asia. The archipelago that Japan had been targeting from the beginning of the war was now almost within reach. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies had already been underway for weeks. Japan's planners had designed a three-pronged approach. In the east, forces were moving down through the islands of Amboina and Timor, severing the chain of communication between the Indies and Australia. In the center, Borneo and Celebes were being invaded simultaneously. And in the west, Sumatra would be struck as soon as Singapore's fate was settled. Once those objectives were secured, the full weight of Japanese power would converge on Java, the most populous island of the archipelago, the center of Allied naval operations in Southeastern Asia, and the seat of the Joint Allied Command. By the time Singapore surrendered, the Japanese were methodically working through the outer islands. Amboina had already fallen. Timor was days away from invasion. Borneo and Celebes had both been entered, and their capitulation was only a matter of time. On February 14th, the day before Singapore's surrender, the first Japanese soldiers arrived in southern Sumatra, not from the sea, but from the sky. 700 paratroopers descended over Palembang, where the Dutch and their allied partners had been frantically destroying the oil fields, storage tanks, and refineries that Japanese forces had come specifically to seize. The Dutch shell installations there, and the only stockpile of high-octane aviation fuel anywhere in the Indies, were already being blown apart when the paratroopers came down. Many of the paratroopers were killed in the fighting that followed the landing, but the battle disrupted the demolition work long enough to matter. Before the destruction could be completed, a massive Japanese fleet arrived offshore: 6 cruisers, an aircraft carrier, 11 destroyers, and 8 transports anchoring at the mouth of the Musi River, 50 miles below Palembang. A full infantry division moved upriver in small craft. In a final act of desperation, the outnumbered defenders released a torrent of oil onto the river and ignited it. The flaming river killed hundreds of Japanese troops. The weight of numbers did not change. Palembang fell the following day, and with it roughly half the oil reserves of the entire Dutch East Indies. The final battle for the archipelago centered on Java. On the afternoon of February 26th, the Allied naval commander in the region, Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, briefed his officers at his headquarters in Surabaya. The setting had a strange formality to it: officers in starched white uniforms and gold braid, toasts raised to friendship and better fortune, a glorious tropical sunset visible through the harbor palms. Dorman explained the mission in measured terms. An invasion fleet was en route to Java. Their task was to find it and destroy it. He thanked the assembled officers and took his leave. It was the last time they would all be in the same room. That evening, the Allied strike force slipped through Surabaya's minefield and formed up in open water. The combined force was built around 5 cruisers, 2 Dutch, 1 British, 1 Australian, and 1 American, the USS Houston, which had been reported sunk so often by Japanese propaganda that her crew had taken to calling her the galloping ghost of the Java coast. Destroyers screened the flanks and the rear. The ships were battered, the crews exhausted. There was no common signal code, no air cover, no reliable intelligence about enemy dispositions, and in a sea surrounded by oil fields, a diminishing supply of fuel. The Battle of the Java Sea was joined the following afternoon, roughly 90 miles north of Surabaya, when the Allied ships encountered not 1 but 2 Japanese convoys covered by a force of 3 cruisers and 14 destroyers under Admiral Takeo Takagi. The Japanese opened at extreme range, 28,000 yards, with salvos from their 8-inch guns. Commander Walter Winslow of the USS Houston recorded in his diary that he watched sheets of copper-colored flame light along the Japanese battle line and understood with a hammering heart that the first salvo was already in the air. The Allied ships fired back. 1 Japanese cruiser was hit and turned out of the line, a fire burning forward of her bridge. But Takagi's gunners were more accurate. A shell found the British cruiser Exeter's engine room, killing 14 men and knocking 6 of her 8 boilers out of action. The Exeter slowed and turned away. A torpedo struck the Dutch destroyer Cortana. She folded in 2 and vanished. The British destroyer Electra took a series of shell hits and sank. As night came down, Takagi pulled his force back to escort the transports into safer waters. Dorman, aboard the cruiser Dorita, set off in pursuit, groping through the darkness without air reconnaissance. Japanese search planes marked his course with smudge flares that burned on the water like orange lanterns. Under cover of that dark, Japanese cruisers closed in. Around midnight, when the opposing forces were less than 10,000 yards apart, 12 specially developed long-range torpedoes were fired. A massive explosion tore apart the Dutch cruiser Java. She went under in flames. Seconds later, a second explosion rocked the Druta, and a column of fire shot into the sky. From the bridge, Dorman ordered the Houston and the Australian cruiser Perth to break off and run for home. Then, in one final convulsive blast, the Dorita went down, taking Dorman and 366 of his men. On February 28th, the Houston and the Perth attempted to pass through the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, hoping to reach the Indian Ocean and relative safety. Neither ship knew that the Japanese had already sealed the passage and were in the process of landing troops near Batavia, Java's capital. Rounding a headland west of the city, the 2 cruisers suddenly found themselves among unattended Japanese transports riding at anchor in the dark. They charged in and sank 2 of them at point-blank range. Minutes later, a Japanese covering force of 3 cruisers and 9 destroyers materialized out of the night. 4 torpedoes struck the Perth and she sank. 3 torpedoes tore into the Houston. As she lay over to starboard, Commander Winslow was hurled into the sea. He watched her go under. The stars and stripes caught a breeze, he remembered, and seemed to wave one last time before the hull took her down. The galloping ghost was gone. The Japanese landed on Java the following day. Allied aircraft attacked the transports and landing craft, but there was little effective resistance on the ground. On March 9th, in Batavia, the Dutch formally surrendered the Indies, ending 3 centuries of domination over the archipelago. The last transmission from the island went out over a commercial radio station. A voice said simply that they were shutting down now. Goodbye until better times. Long live the Queen. Emperor Hirohito, receiving the news of the Dutch surrender in Tokyo, allowed himself a moment of unease amid the celebration. The fruits of war, he told a close advisor, were tumbling into Japanese hands almost too quickly. His military commanders did not share that anxiety. They had already moved on to the next objective. Burma was isolated, mountainous, and predominantly jungle, a country that had been a British preserve since the late 19th century and that sat at the southwestern edge of the entire campaign's design. The strategic logic of taking Burma was twofold. First, it would remove the threat of a British counterattack from the north against Japan's newly won holdings in Malaya and the Indies. Second, and perhaps more important, it would cut the Burma Road, the tortuous mountain highway that wound through the ranges of Upper Burma and served as the only viable overland route by which China's Western allies could supply the Chinese armies still resisting Japan's occupying forces. Sever that road, and China might at last be broken. The campaign opened on December 23, 1941, when roughly 60 Japanese bombers appeared over Rangoon, Burma's capital, its military headquarters, and one of the busiest ports on the Indian Ocean. The raid killed more than 2,000 people who had come out into the streets, some to cheer, their long simmering resentment of British colonial rule briefly overtaken by the spectacle, others simply to watch. 6 more days of bombing followed, triggering a mass exodus that clogged the roads north of the city and paralyzed the administrative machinery of the colonial government. Rangoon's population fell from 400,000 to 150,000. The docks fell silent, the warehouses lay open to looters, and the fire and medical services ceased to function. A ground attack followed, launched by troops of Lieutenant General Shojiro Iida's 15th Army moving in from Thailand. By the 3rd week of January, 2 Japanese divisions had broken through the jungle country east of Rangoon and reached the flat rice fields and rubber plantations around Mulmen, the port city 90 miles southeast of the capital, the city made famous to Western readers by Kipling's poem, now suddenly acquiring a far grimmer kind of attention. The British command in Burma was divided over where to make a stand. Major General John Smith, whose 17th Indian Division bore primary responsibility for southern Burma's defense, wanted to anchor his force on the west bank of the Sittang River, a strong natural defensive line with good roads behind it for supply and reinforcement. General Warville, commanding from Java, overruled him. He ordered the fight to be carried as far forward as possible, hoping to slow the Japanese advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. It was a judgment made from a great distance, about ground Wavell could not see. On February 14th, Smith took a position at the Sittang River, 30 miles east of the Sittang. After a week of fighting that cost his force serious casualties, he was compelled to fall back to the Sittang with what remained of his division. What happened at the Sittang River crossing became the defining catastrophe of the Burma campaign. The only span across the river was a single-lane railroad trestle. British engineers rigged it for demolition and laid planks across the tracks so that vehicles could drive over. In the hours before dawn on February 22nd, headlights off, the trucks began rolling toward the west bank. Smith and his staff and part of one depleted brigade made it across. Then, at around 4 in the morning, a truck slipped its planks and wedged itself between the ties. It could not be freed. The bridge was blocked. All movement stopped for 2.5 hours, and behind the truck, stretching back 6 miles along a narrow jungle road, the line backed up, trucks, mules, and thousands of British and Indian soldiers standing in the dark, waiting, exposed. Then the Japanese came in from the north, outflanking the column and driving a wedge between the stranded troops and the western bridgehead. Entire companies were destroyed in the initial attack. The formation disintegrated. Some units broke and ran. Half a brigade disappeared into the jungle. By nightfall, everything east of the bridge was cut off. Brigadier Noel Hugh Jones, commanding the bridgehead, faced a choice with no good answer. Leave the bridge intact, and the Japanese could cross it with the remnants of Smith's force, pour onto the west bank, and march on Rangoon. Blow the bridge, and every man still east of the Sittang would be abandoned. Hugh Jones gave the order to blow. At 5:30 the following morning, one soldier recalled, there was a sequence of deafening explosions, then a blinding flash and a wave of superheated air. The bridge lifted from its supports and was swept away by the river. Survivors on the west bank, including a number who had swum across from the far side in the night, jammed themselves into trains and moved toward Rangoon. Of the 8,500 men who had entered the battle, roughly 3,500 made it out alive. Rangoon was already dying. Japanese aircraft attacked without pause. Bombs had fallen on the city zoo, shattering the cages. Crocodiles and boa constrictors were loose in the streets. A minor British official, his mind broken by the weeks of destruction around him, released every prisoner from the jails, every patient from the insane asylum, and every resident of the leper colony before taking his own life. On February 27th, Burma's governor, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, cabled London with the assessment that nothing he could see had any prospect of saving Rangoon. That night he dined at Government House with his aide and 2 journalists newly arrived from England. Of 110 household servants, only the cook, the butler, and the kennel keeper remained. As the city burned outside, they consumed a 3-course meal. The mutton, he later noted, was excellent, and finished the last bottles from the wine cellar. Then they moved to the billiards room for a final game. The walls were lined with portraits of Burma's former governors. Dorman Smith's aide studied those painted faces and suggested it might be best to deny them to the Japanese. He let fly with a billiard ball. One portrait fell. The others joined in, and the floor filled with shattered frames and torn canvas. It was a massacre, Dorman Smith later said. A new commander arrived shortly afterward, General Harold Alexander, who had led the last British troops off the beach at Dunkirk in 1940, came from Calcutta to take command. He concluded, with the clarity of someone seeing the situation fresh, that he might be able to save another British army, even though saving Burma itself was beyond anyone's power. On March 7th, he ordered the destruction of the Burma Oil Company's storage tanks at Sirium, outside Rangoon. In 70 minutes, 150 million gallons of oil went up. The smoke column climbed, by the estimates of pilots flying past, to roughly 23,000 feet. Then Alexander ordered his troops north. The defense of the upper country, including the Burma Road itself, had initially fallen to the 1st Burma Division, composed largely of hill tribesmen from near the Chinese border, ferocious fighters who had no doubt about which side they were on. When a Chinese expeditionary force arrived in mid-March, provided by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and led in the field by American General Joseph Stilwell, the 1st Burma Division was freed to move south. Stilwell's force, formerly designated the 5th and 6th Chinese armies, amounted to 50,000 men despite its imposing title. A third force, the 66th Chinese Army, arrived later. With these reinforcements, Stilwell and Alexander attempted to establish a defensive line in the Promtungur area, 150 miles north of Rangoon. The Chinese held stubbornly at Tungur before being driven out by a numerically superior Japanese force. The defensive line broke. The Burma campaign had turned into a rout. The dramatic final chapter still lay ahead, but the outcome of the larger contest, the struggle for Southeast Asia that Japan had set in motion on the morning of December 7, 1941, was already beyond dispute. From the Mariana Islands to the Malay Peninsula, from the Philippines to the Burmese jungle, an empire of conquest had been assembled in a matter of months. The cascade had run its course.